Hey friends, welcome to Death and a Butterfly. I'm your host, Kerry. Join me as we delve into a broad spectrum of topics, including, but not limited to, spirituality and well-being. Sharing knowledge for the modern journeyer, welcome to the thought process. Glad you're here and we can resonate together. Please like and subscribe to stay updated, and if you enjoy what you hear, please share with someone you love.
Okay, so we're going to talk about journeys, life journeys. Getting through the shit, the traumas.
What defines you through your timelines, I guess?
Yeah, basically.
By the way, folks, it's Taurean. He's back. We were at one of the OG podcasts of Kerry here. It's been a few years, but now we're back in the midst of all the chaos of the last couple of years.
Yeah, so I think I said that I was going to go on a hiatus until I kind of figured out what I wanted to do. So I think the beginning of my podcasting days was a little bit more of maybe processing a bit of my own trauma, but also being vulnerable and speaking to what was occurring in my life to also show that, not everybody is alone. But I guess furthering that process now, I want to start showing the vulnerability of people around me so that perhaps you sharing your story might help someone else.
That sounds pretty vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds pretty transparent, and let's get it done. That sounds like a great idea. I mean, we can only share our gifts through truth and transparency, in my opinion. So, by all means, I mean, where should we start, Kerry?
I mean, as always, we could just start with childhood and go from there. I think a lot of the things, even though people say that they don't have traumas, it could be something as little as like bullying that starts to shape how you in turn react or move in social situations around people. And then kind of work through the timeline, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely want to start at the beginning, I would say. Captain Obvious here again, Taurean. Yeah, I guess when I was younger, I guess how it started off with was I wasn't, it wasn't a two-parent home. My mother was thrusted into the role of motherhood and fatherhood. Shortly after I was born, my mother had to end the relationship with my father because he was just acting out and acting foolish, and he wasn't really present, nor did he want to be, shortly after I was born. And at the beginning it was a struggle because we didn't have a lot of money. I mean, the first, I'd say 8 months to a year of my life, we lived in a car. So there wasn't a lot of money there, but obviously I was too young to see this at that age, but as I got a little bit older, I got to see the hard work, the perseverance, the struggles that my mom went through, but she ultimately understood her role as a mother, and she really busted her ass to provide for me. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I didn't really have struggle in that sense. She was a great role model. She worked hard. She went back to school to get a better paying job. And even during that process, when she asked for help from, her parents or friends, they weren't necessarily available, or they shut her down. So that forced her to work even harder. And I got to see that at the beginning. And then as that grew into the space, my mom was obviously a little overwhelmed with trying to juggle a job and trying to juggle, being a mother and allowing me to go into events. She said ultimately, well, he's got a lot of energy. He's a boy. Why don't we think about putting him into a sport? And honestly, that's what pushed my narrative, or it's literally been my life story, is to be physically fit more importantly, attached to athletics. So when I was about 3.5, 4 years old, that's when I started playing soccer. My mom threw me into that sport, and I was a ball of energy. But I was quite volatile. I was very expressive and transparent, but I was just very impulsive and reactionary. It just kind of moved into my adulthood. I've just learned how to manage it a little bit. But that's where it started. As we started moving into that space, my mom was able to upgrade our living situation, and eventually she bought a condo on the north side of Edmonton here in Castle Downs, and that was a pretty cool spot. I was very privileged and blessed to live in a place like that, because it was almost like going out to, I don't know, a cottage out in the mountains when there's this big open space, and the framework of the actual condo was built with old school like pieces of wood, and it was a really nice place. Now that I sit back and reflect, we even had a fireplace, like a wooden fireplace.
Nice.
A place called Northwoods Village for all us Northsiders here. You might be familiar with that. So, yeah, that was interesting.
Would you say that with the privilege of being in sports and to then have that roof over your head, would you say that she was also, for your mother, really able to not hide, but really shelter you from, I guess, the darker side of the things, that she just always made sure that you didn't necessarily have to worry about any of that?
Absolutely. She was a champion. My mother was a hero. She did a really good job for a very long time carrying forth good energy when she saw me, because if I was to go a layer deeper, she didn't have that in her childhood and eventual, being reared as a kid with her parents and their family dynamic was very volatile because of the career paths that like my grandfather and my grandmother chose. And my grandmother was, an aspiring model and an actress, and then my grandfather was a musician. And their home life was very volatile just because of the egos present and how they actioned out or projected on one another. And I think that's perspective gave my mother an opportunity to say, well, I don't want to carry this problem moving forward.
Cycle breaking.
Yeah, that's what I mean by heroism, right? And I was also a lucky one. I forgot to add that at the beginning. My mom tried to conceive quite a few times. With my father, obviously, but even previous to that. She wasn't successful, so I should have had like 2 sisters and a brother, if I can recall properly. So she had me a little late, I guess. She would have been 36, 37. So that was part of the perspective that she was carrying forward. And I guess the challenge in our family unit was the fact that she had left the eastern part of Canada to pursue opportunities out west in Alberta, and she was ultimately on her own out here. So again, she really instilled the value of building family regardless of blood. And we actually had a very close family that wasn't necessarily blood related to us, but became ultimately family, and she taught me that at a young age. So I carried that forward, in my elementary school years and whatnot. But the unfortunate thing was when I was going through those experiences, I was a friendly kid. I was very extroverted. I try to be as authentic and project as much as possible, but I was reprimanded for that, right? Talking out of turn, or being the so-called class clown. I got in trouble a lot.
Did that affect how you moved, I guess, further on throughout schooling or friendships? Did you maybe try to make that smaller because you were getting reprimanded, or did you just continue being your true authentic self?
Probably a mixture of both. Great question. I think what it started to happen was because I was an only child, and my mom did her best to lay the groundwork for rewards and celebrations of positive things I did, maybe that snowballed or carried over into I became very selfish. I became a very controlling person as a really young age. And I'd always try to lead groups of friends that I'd end up managing or having with only the activities I wanted to do and the things that I wanted to do.
Managing there,
right?
Yeah.
Right? Like, and I learned at a young age the consequences of that, because I'd have groups of friends where they'd want to kick it with me and hang out with me, but then they realize how controlling and how upset I get when things didn't go my way. And then I literally felt the visceral consequences of that. It'd be like summer at the end of, I don't know, grade 2 or 3. And, you know, I'd lose those group of friends over the course of summer indefinitely because they just didn't want to deal with my crap anymore, because I was being very manipulative, or not so much manipulative, but controlling, right? So I had to learn that. I guess one thing that became very apparent, though, was, and I mean, you see this in society now, there is some subtleties and layers of discrimination and, you know, racism that can happen, and I ultimately did feel those events, like those things actually happened to me. You know, in the context of what I just shared maybe a couple of minutes ago, I was a class clown, if you will, and maybe spoke out of turn, but I had straight A's, right? Like I was intelligent and I was engaged with class, but obviously I'd either get bored or I needed more enticement, so I'd interact with, you know, my classmates, maybe more so than the teacher wanted at those certain lecture points, and that ultimately got me in trouble. And I was always trying to, you know, make people laugh. That was my thing. But when I was reprimanded, or when I was dealt consequences for those behaviors, my consequences were substantially worse than some of the other kids in class who didn't have the same skin complexion of me. And it came to a head a couple times. And to add to that note, going back to my mom's heroism, she always taught me to stand up for myself and definitely set boundaries when they matter most, especially when you're getting mistreated. And she really instilled that in me, and that's what I mean. She did both roles as a mother and a father very well. She definitely interjected masculinity for me at a young age, which it can be a rare feat for a woman, you know, a single mother. So thanks again, Mom. But there's a couple incidents when I was getting in trouble in those grades, like 2 to 4, where the discipline got a little ridiculous, right? It got either violent or was really extreme. I remember one time there was a teacher in grade 3 who used to physically shake me. I was a small kid. I actually didn't gain my frame and my size till like maybe grade 10, 11. Even still, I wasn't as big as I am now. But this teacher would grab me by the wrist or even by the neck and like violently shake me to try to get me to behave. And usually it worked to some degree, but then it became something where that was the first thing she reached towards, or that was the first sense of consequence. Even if I was like slightly slipping or slightly had, you know, some type of issue.
How did that affect you in terms of teachers are supposed to be kind of like your guardians for school? They're supposed to give you a safe space. They're supposed to help you succeed, not assault you.
Yeah. Well, oddly enough, it's a great question again. So Kerry's the expert, folks. That would have planted the seeds into kind of the context and the lens that I carry now. I would hope. And what I realized that even at the young age and now moving into my adulthood was people can be given, you know, responsibilities or roles as leaders that ultimately gives them responsibilities. And if they are unable to look at that universal truth or look at that universal responsibility and act accordingly, sometimes they're given a position of power and they abuse it. And we've seen that time and time again as violent or as challenging and as traumatic as some of those experiences were back then, it was the catalyst to see what's kind of happening now and understand that dynamic, that it happens at every stage in life. It can happen at a young age, it can happen in your teenage years. And luckily, again, because of my mom's heroism and input and some of the other inputs I chose, when these events happen in my life, I'm very adamant to completely shutting them down or calling it out for what it is. So going back to that story with the violent shaking, it got to a point where I'd either cry or I'd literally call out the teacher and be like, this is not acceptable behavior. But it kept happening. So what I had to do was obviously tell my mother, and she walked into that, classroom, and she put the fear of God into people. And one of her statements was, if you crossed the line, and she had to handle it, because of course she wasn't a pussy, she'd tell you that it was time to dance, right? And dancing, not in the literal term, you can kind of put two and two together and understand where she was taking that. So that happened in, grade 3. And then as I was moving more into my elementary, years, I did get, lots of different perspectives from these teachers that were ultimately responsible for a group of classmates. And I started growing up a bit and realizing my participation and my actions affecting others. And I can't say all my teachers were bad. I had a couple amazing teachers. I had a grade 3 teacher for half the year. She was amazing. Then I had a grade 4 teacher that tried a different approach with me in respects to behaving more, and it worked wonders. But when moving into grade 5, before I transferred locations here in Edmonton and moved into the inner city, there was another pretty traumatic event, as you were asking. At this point I'd started, I guess you would call it, slipping again, and misbehaving a little bit more. And during this whole tenure, I was still playing a lot of sports. My mother actually became my coach for our soccer team, but I became a very defiant young boy and made her job very difficult. And this was moving into our elementary time, and everybody, all the adults around me were finding it very hard to, I guess, discipline me and get me to follow the rules. But again, some of the punishments started getting a little extreme. One that I can remember was I essentially got locked up in solitary confinement. At this stage, when you've been disciplined so many times and you don't get it, they have to escalate the consequences. But for most students, if they got to this stage, that was an out of school suspension, a couple days where you weren't allowed in the school. But they had manipulated it to a place where I had in-school suspensions on plural days, and it got extreme where they put me into a specific room. They turned off the lights, they removed any type of food or water, and they actually locked the door. And that's where it started getting a little extreme. And obviously, as a boy, I don't have maybe the maturity, the experience that I would now, so I reacted a lot differently. I was punching and screaming at the door and this and that. And like I said, I think one of my biggest qualities, I've always been transparent, no matter what. So I obviously shared this sentiment with my mother on one particular day, and she was at first kind of dumbfounded, being like, hey, that didn't really happen, did it? And I was like, it did. And then it happened the next day. And it just so happened that my mother was coming to pick me up on that particular day. She hadn't arranged some babysitting, and she got to see firsthand what I was experiencing. This was now the second day of this said solitary confinement punishment. And she had showed up at the school trying to look for me, and this is after school hours. And the people, enforcing this, responsible, and the collective people that were, responsible for enforcing this had already gone home for the day. So they had essentially forgotten about me. And the only person left in the school at the time was the principal. And she was a replacement principal. A little bit of a shocker here, a little bit of a fill-in on this story. She was a replacement principal for that particular year, because in that particular year, at the beginning of the year, our principal at the time was dealing with a lot of personal issues, and he decided to commit suicide in his office. And this was right at the beginning of this year. So she came in and she was thrusted into the role, but she just had bad energy. She just really didn't care. She always had this, resting bitch face and was really disrespectful to kids, like really scared them. So it wasn't a surprise that she was cool with this. And, it just so happened that my mom had been scaling the school, grounds or walking through to try to find me. And she had walked by that particular room, and there was a chair in this room, so I managed to put the chair, in front of the doorway. And I was banging on the window, and she happened to walk by, so she heard me. And to make this story a little bit shorter, she went for a dance with this said, principal as they opened the door, and she demanded that they let me out. So there was a lot of feedback in my younger days, and I'm very appreciative for that now, because my mom was very good at giving feedback on a positive sense, but also negative, and it always came from a neutral space. Like she wasn't always negative. She wasn't always telling me that I was doing something wrong, and she wasn't always just celebrating everything I did right. She was pretty neutral. She stood and experienced those things with me, and she shared out of her knowledge base or her mindset what was the value in it. So I had a lot of that, moving into my early, teenage years. Yeah.
I guess the next question for me then is, going through all of those experiences, and then also like the acting out and the reactivity, and then them being reactive back with you, and then the dances. Did it kind of teach you that reactivity just eventually escalated to fisticuffs, or was that kind of like a step-by-step that if it continued, it was eventually going to lead to some fisticuffs?
I would definitely agree with that statement. Yeah, again, we're sharing this perspective going back, but it ultimately ties into what's happening now, and I think that's the one big thing in the world that we've failed to manage, is practicing the pause and having discernment behind read and reaction, sentiments, events, circumstances. And I got to see that firsthand, what that looked like, right? So yeah, no, definitely, absolutely. And somebody has to champion a conversation, or somebody has to take the bigger, audacious role of finding either a pragmatic or, this is a very common word, a democratic, peace. Mm-hmm. And that takes a bigger perspective, as opposed to staying in that read and reaction, fight or flight response. But you're not going to know that as a kid, right? You're definitely not going to know that as a kid. And I think it's ultimately, older humans, adults, and especially parents, to jump into that role full steam ahead and find out their best ways and strategies to teach, the younger crowds to do that. And you have to ultimately make that decision yourself, and you can't fall to the whim of those set emotions and reactions on your own spectrum. And that's something you have to develop on a higher scale or a higher lens, right? And
I think that's fair to say, because I'll use my childhood as an example. My parents both had some traumas in their life, and it wasn't dealt with. So then they went through their life being reactive or whatever else it was as a coping mechanism. But then I learned that.
Right.
And then as an adult, I've now taken a step back to actually look at some of the things that I do. And I'm like, okay, well, no, that's a learned actually perspective. And I'm going to stop doing that because that's not actually good for what I'm going for in my life. So I think it's always important, because a lot of the things that we learn as children is in like unconscious pattern behavior that we've learned from adults.
100%. Yeah. And it always takes a moment to design something differently, and it actually has to be a habit and an action you choose. because it's so much easier to fall into that read and reaction state that's just inherently given to us. And it doesn't take any work to do that.
But it takes a lot of energy to do it.
Yeah. But you're just going along for the ride. You're not actually in control or having any sense of control, right? And that's why it can be volatile. And like you said, it takes a lot of energy. It can be very taxing. And then you can end up in a loop, which is ultimately you don't want to. Yeah. Yeah.
So moving forward with that, teen years, young adulthood.
Yeah, I mean, so right at that junction, now I'm like, 8 or 9, and the unfortunate thing I think in life that I've definitely learned now moving into my space, being at my age now, if we were to dial it back to that, 9, 10, 11-year-old and moving into that stage, there's only so many, I guess, shields or things you can gloss over or not be honest about in your own life or your own timeline that won't eventually catch up with you. And going back to the heroism of my mother, during that time and probably all the experiences and the trauma she had, because hers were much worse than mine, caught up with her because she was a healthy-ish person, but she wasn't super healthy in respects to she picked up smoking at a young age, right, 14, and she continued to smoke. And when I was about 10, and I was now living with that kind of chosen family that we had because we were very close. And that was out of circumstances that they were going under on a personal note. Luckily, my cousin at the time, who was 3 years older than me, was living with me. Because I'd come home from school and it was near the end of the school year. And for whatever reason, my mother started having issues breathing. And she was just trying to be the champion and invincible. That's what mothers do. And she had failed to inform me that she had had an issue with asthma. And she obviously continued to smoke, and she was dealing with stress of adulthood and parent rearing and probably the shit that I was putting her through a little bit. And it all caught up with her. And I remember one day I got home from school, and my cousin was living with us because of his family situation, and his older brother was living with mother, and they were trying to figure all that stuff out. And my mom comes home one day from school, or from work, and me and my cousin are at home, and she just looks at us and she starts like wheezing, and we're both just like, what the heck's going on? And she had just gotten me a new computer, and I was checking that out. Because when I wasn't playing soccer and being super active out in the bush, and that's one thing that I'm very blessed about, our generation still played outside. I'm just throwing that out there. And we were always outside. But when I'd finally run out of gas, I was inside and I was a gamer. Pretty imaginative gamer, right? I'd play a video game and I'd give the characters names and voiceovers and stuff. But anyways, playing a particular game on the computer, and my mom starts wheezing. And I could see the look of fear in her face. And that didn't happen very often. I told you, man, she wore a cape. So she came through and she starts wheezing, and she gives me this look. And then she gave my cousin a look. And she didn't know how to tell us, but she's like, somebody grab the phone. And I've never seen this from my mother before. She's a pretty strong woman. And she just looked at me and she said, Kate, I have something to tell you. And I was like, oh shit. This is 10 years coming. I haven't heard this yet. And she's like, yeah, I'm having an asthma attack and it's not going too well, and you might have to call 911. And I'm not proud of this, but I froze. Right? I froze. I didn't know what to do. I was, genuinely scared for her well-being and didn't know what to do. So my cousin, being 3 years older, he got a little nervous, but he went into action. Right? He called the number, and I just started crying a little bit. But I got it together, and we were on the phone with the nurses there. And they sent, the ambulance. But what was interesting was, in the gist of that extremism and the intensity of it, it's interesting how when you're really thrust into a role that's important and you give a shit about somebody, you love somebody, you gain superpowers. So my cousin, being, a couple years older than me, goes to meet the paramedics as they're trying to make their way up to our condo, and The unfortunate thing with the condo was there was these set of stairs he had to climb up, and for whatever reason, these fully grown adults could not pick up this stretcher to bring up these set of stairs and eventually put my mother on the stretcher to hopefully take her to safety and try to save her life. So he's sitting there waiting, and now I'm losing it because my mom's like barely able to breathe, and she's trying to pant, and she's trying to tell me to chill, and I'm just crying, right? And finally my cousin had had enough because they were taking their sweet time. So he, being a 13-year-old boy, I think, or 14, just picked up this gurney himself and just walked it up. And all these adults looked at him and like, well, this and that. And then he told them, yeah, get it together, put her on the, the gurney. So that was the first instance where I realized my mother's health was going to be in question. And unfortunately, throughout her tenure after that, it was almost a yearly thing where she had serious health issues. And it was like almost every year she ended up close to the hospital or in the hospital, and she was sick. And it was stemmed from, the years of stress, the medications, right? You've probably heard my story and how I stand and all this stuff going on, and I will stand strong with that because it's complete bogus. And some of her healthier choices got repurposed for reactions and stress and impulse and emotions, and she started becoming more and more unhealthy as I got a little older.
You get into your coping mechanisms, right.
Yeah, so that's where it started getting a little dicey. When I moved into junior high, the same issues kind of erupted. I got a little bit better for a bit, and then I wouldn't, and my marks were still good. But what started happening was when I was getting close to finishing junior high, moving into high school, I stopped giving a crap about doing the same stuff in respects to being very dedicated to sports. I played a lot of soccer, and I was on a premier team and took it as serious as I could. And I wanted to start exploring and being curious to another side of life, which involved hanging out with not the best people and moving into a space of less physical activity. And then I started getting introduced to things like alcohol, right? And I'm proud to say this now, and I'll always say this, I've never really gotten into hard drugs, but I've my older cousin and then some of my peers, as we moved into like junior high and high school, started trying things like weed, and that got purposed into my life. And more so, I stopped exercising as much and got more comfortable essentially being lazy. And I stopped going to school. And then when I got into high school, that's when my attendance started dropping. And guess what? This schooling actually got a little bit harder. It wasn't as easy for me. I actually needed to apply myself because the study was a lot harder and the courses were a lot harder. But instead of taking on that role, because I was choosing different habits, I started finding excuses or just simply running. And that obviously put more stress, not only on myself, but, on my mom.
What made you feel like you wanted to run, though?
New experience. I wanted to fit in. I was always a people pleaser. Again, like, it was always if somebody didn't like me, I had to find out why. And so I was trying to make people laugh. And, I gained that sentiment from my mother. She was a people pleaser. And, we could reverse a little bit of time here. My parents eventually got back together when I was about 10. Shortly thereafter, they got married. And I think because my dad was trying to make up for lost time, when he first got interjected back in my life, I had all these questions and I was angry and I projected that on him, but he just took it. Like, he wouldn't do anything. He wouldn't discipline me. I'd be verbally abusive to him, and he would just take me to the carnival and get me whatever I wanted. And he was trying to essentially buy my love. But then about after a year and a half after that all went down, my parents had eventually decided to, coexist, get married. He started to try to become a father figure as I was moving into this timeline and being more defiant and missing school and this and that. And he was just trying to survive too. They were both working long hours. My dad was a trucker, and he'd put in, 14, 16-hour days, come home, and he'd have maybe an hour or two to himself. And he always carried that sentiment of a man's work is never done, right? And he's not lying, folks. Like, it's legit, especially this day and age. So there was a lot of positive opportunities in my life and a lot of positive things. I had a roof over my head. My parents were willing to support me with, physical endeavors and events. But the underlying issue that I caught as I got older and I took a time to reflect was there was a lot of anxiousness in my family unit. My mom and my dad carried a lot of anxious undertones. And there was a lot of pressure that they put on themselves and on me, and it came out in their behaviors towards each other and towards me. And my dad wanted to set some boundaries, but my mom probably just was getting concerned about her own health and worried about like where I was going, and she didn't want me to get hurt, so she would just always try to baby me. And there'd been a couple events that I didn't share yet, but a couple serious collisions or serious things that happened where I got injured pretty badly. So she was concerned about that. And then when I was in grade 10, moving into grade 11, I befriended a group of wise guys. And that was kind of the biggest, I guess, catalyst or biggest trigger, if you will, to truly get my shit together. Because I ultimately almost lost my life. And if it wasn't for the a couple circumstances or a couple choices that I made, and must have been God looking over me, I probably would have passed away due to the extent of my injuries. So yeah, that was pretty intense, and that's what really snapped me out of this rebellion and this choice of curiosity that wanted me to essentially try to be a thug or cool, right? Instead of being that athlete that I wanted to be. Yeah.
So, if you don't mind sharing.
Yeah, I was just waiting for Kerry to throw that in, folks.
What
We're going to take a deep breath. So.
What occurred with thug life?
Yeah, and that's essentially what it was. So, grade 10, moving into grade 11. First year of grade 10 was interesting. I missed a lot of school, but I ultimately had a goal to become a professional football player. And my first year in high school, I obviously tried out for the football team. And I remember my first practice afterwards, I was like, holy shit, maybe I'm not built for this football stuff, because it was way more intense than soccer. The pain that you take from the collisions, right? But then I rallied, and obviously I had a really good season. That was my sport. I was a good athlete, fast, agile. I had a pair of kahunas. I could definitely put in that work. I never shied away from work. I've still carried over that sentiment. Anyways, moving into grade 11, now I stopped hanging out with some of my closer friends that I had grown up with, that I spent countless hours with on the weekends, and that was some of the best times of my life, man. On the weekends, we would just kick it, play video games, shoot the shit, just be bros. That's all we did in one friend's house. But I got away from that crowd and started to try to, quote unquote, find my identity in the droves and pressures of media influence. And when I say identity, folks, I mean finding my quote unquote black side or my thug side. And two particular people had moved into the high school that I was attending, and I tried to befriend these two dudes, and they were bad news. They came from foster care and had issues with behaviors and started moving into more criminal elements, and they were adamant about skipping school and vandalizing properties, or going to a store and stealing small items and stuff like that. And I was just trying to fit in with them, right? I had all these strings pulling at me, and I had made friends that were close to the same friends that I was hanging out with in my junior high school years, but I started moving away from them to hang out with these two guys for identity, because they were black, I guess that's what it was. So this all cultivated into grade 11. This is after our football season, and it went well, but now it's moving into winter, and it's right before holiday break there in December. And one of these kids in particular, after I'd spent lots of time with him, he had been over at my house for my birthday dinner, and was planning on coming over for Christmas dinner, because of course he was in foster care and he wasn't taken care of. that was kind of our family thing, is like whenever we heard somebody was struggling or had anything going on, they were more than welcome to come to our house to help them. So right before this Christmas break, this guy gets into it with somebody in a classroom setting, and every high school, I shouldn't say every high school, but this high school definitely had the fighter's pit, right? The place to go and settle your differences. So that the plan was he was supposed to fight this kid to do this, and he dodged out on it. My friend was pretty upset because he was like, well, this guy started it, so we should handle it. And I agree with that statement. Sometimes things get out a lot, and you need to handle it mano a mano, right? And it is what it is, especially if somebody's physically assaulted you or threatened you. So that's what it was supposed to happen. It didn't happen. And at this point, when I was hanging out with these guys, there was about 5 or 6 of them, I've started realizing, like, I don't know if this is my crowd, right? Like, I was just like, but I felt the peer pressures of continuing to hang out with them, and I didn't want to make them think anything different of me if I decided to slowly but surely, like, leave that space, right? So anyways, at that point, I almost took a collective sigh. I was like, okay, it's not going to happen. This isn't going to get as wild as it should. But they were adamant about finding this fool. And lo and behold, some guy who actually lived in this dude's complex walks by. He's like, oh, actually, I know where he lives. I'll show you. So now us posse of 5 strong go waltzing over to this guy's house and confront him. And I watched these guys try to lay a licking on him. It wasn't too intensive, but the guy felt it, right? He was very scared and worried and this and that. I just watched it happen. And this was like that moment where I'm like, you're fucking up. You're hanging out with the wrong people. It's time to maybe take a step back. And luckily no one got like seriously hurt. The guy was just freaked out. And I just got up and left shortly thereafter. But then we come back from our Christmas break, get into school, and every single one of us in this group of 5 get called down to the office, and long story short, we all get expelled, and we're now up for pressing charges for, assault with a weapon or weapons. And I remember when they interviewed me, there was a group of kids just down the block that were in an adjacent school. I went to Vic Com, and I ain't a snitch. I'm just going to throw that out there. I actually blamed it on the St. Joe's kids, because they were aware of these St. Joe's kids who were also hoodlums, and we would have talkings to from time to time. So I blamed it on them. But somehow in our group, someone had to change this narrative into I was the snitch, or I was the person who told that, we did this and we were involved. So now we're expelled from school, or press charges, this and that. And I catch wind that guy that came over to my house for, Christmas, or my birthday dinner, and was supposed to come over for Christmas dinner, is looking for me. He's got an issue with me. And I'm like thinking in my head, I'm like, I don't treat friends like this. It's one thing I forgot to mention, folks. I'm stubbornly loyal to the point where people will walk all over me. And I've tried to learn that in my life. So I'm hearing all this noise from the street, and people saying, he's looking for you, he's got a problem with you. I was like, what? Like, we're friends. Regardless of whether we're getting charged for this and that, I wouldn't do that to him, even if we had a falling out. But that's his business. And during this whole ordeal, I was expelled, and my parents had gotten really upset, and we actually had a falling out ourselves, which escalated to an actual fist fight with my father. And it got bad. Like, I hit him once, and he hit me once, twice, 3 times, split my eye open. And I had to actually move into my auntie's house, the one that I was speaking about earlier in my childhood. And I was disowning my parents because I thought that was a little extreme when all that shit went down. But all of that dust had essentially settled, and now I had moved back into my parents' house, and I was able to acquire an opportunity to get correspondence courses so I could stay on top of my schooling. And it was now at this junction where my parents were like, okay, well, you've been grounded forever, but now we're going to give you a little bit of leeway. Let's go out and, or you can go out and celebrate. And I was dating somebody at the time. My best friend had actually set up the situation, and he introduced me to this woman, and I started dating her. And we were going to go see a movie. but I had to catch a bus to go to Kingsway to go see this said movie. And it was beginning of March. And you know how March can be like almost spring, winter weather. It was one of those days, a Friday. And it was warmish. It was getting warmer, but of course it's going to get dark soon. And I don't like cold weather, folks. I'm just putting that out there. Like if it's +5, it's cold for me. So, and mom being mom is just going to be your mom. I had this down-filled jacket, and I thought I wasn't going to wear it because I wanted to look cool. And I leave the room, or I leave my house and go to walk a few steps. My mom yells from the door. She's like, "Is that going to be warm enough? Are you going to zip it up?" I'm like, she's like, "Why don't you just grab your down-filled jacket?" And I was like, maybe she's right. Literally, folks, the only thing that saved my life. So I went back, grabbed this said jacket. I've always had a weird, uncanny ability where I get like butterflies, or intuition tells me when something's not going right or something's going to go terribly wrong.
Butterflies usually are bad things.
Right.
Just so we know.
100%. So I went, grabbed the jacket. I go to wait for this bus at Kingsway, at my stop to get to Kingsway. And I get these butterflies. I'm like, something bad's going to happen when I get to this bus stop. As soon as I pull up to the bus stop, I'm supposed to meet them in Kingsway. And then from Kingsway, we were going to go catch another bus to go to the theater. As soon as I get off the bus stop, lo and behold, there's this dude. He's apparently been my friend, but now doesn't like me. He's rolling 4 deep. Sees me from across the bus stop, comes sprinting over. I'm like, okay, here we go. And he immediately confronts me about the whole situation and says, "I know you snitched and this." And I was like, "No, dude, I would never do that. There's no way. We were friends. Like, it's not happening." And there's like 4 of them. 4 of them, not 5 of them. And they're all like circling me, right? They got it like a kind of a circle around me. And luckily, you remember, folks, I had the older cousin and my mom, and I'd taken boxing a little bit. So I know how to defend myself. And growing up in the inner city or areas like that, I know when things are going to pop off. And I'm no slouch in the combat department. But there's 4 of them. And I'm looking around trying to keep my eye on all of them, and he's having this conversation with me. And I so happen to take my eyes off of him. And as I glance back into his direction, he punches me in the nose and kind of almost jerseys me. Now there's a whole crowd around Kingsway watching this shit. And I happen to get the shirt off of my face, and we're kind of tussling. And I push him back slightly, and he goes, "You want to get shanked or what?" And I was like, "What?" And he reaches across my shoulder and pokes me on the left side of my, back, if you will. 3 times. Yeah, and one that glanced off my shoulder. And at this point, I was it felt surreal, so I didn't think to fight him. He's still my friend, and I'm kind of oh, what's going on? But my hesitation is what allowed him to do this, and he actually gets it through and stabs me 2-3 times. And I think he was hoping that at that point I would drop and he'd continue the assault, but what it did was I snapped out of it, and I actually got angry and I actually chased him. And remember the down-filled jacket? It saved my life, because if I wasn't wearing that down-filled jacket with that layer of protection or that thickness, it probably would have punctured my heart, and that would have been it. So I chased him into the back alley from the Kingsway, bus terminal, which is adjacent to that McDonald's at Kingsway. And he's still running his mouth. And again, I think he was a little dumbfounded that I didn't drop, because I'm chasing him. Now I'm yelling at him. And we just so happened to have a mutual friend that was working at McDonald's. And he comes sprinting out, and he's like, "What the hell did you do, Taurean? This is ridiculous." And he keeps running his mouth. And at this point, I've snapped. And when I snap, that's it. I'm just going to go after you. There's no stopping it. And I keep trying to go after him. And my homie's like, no. We got to go somewhere, man. So I happen to walk back to my friend's house, who just lives 2 blocks down the way. And by the way, folks, God rest his soul. He's not with us anymore. But I go to his place. And I literally kick the door open and start telling him what's happening. I'm like, "I need a towel. I've been stabbed." All this stuff. And the first person I call is my cousin. Me trying to be a hero or trying to be a warrior or something. I'm like, "Yo, show up at Mike's house and we're going to go do it." And he's like, yo. He's like, "You're going to call 911. We're going to make sure you're okay. I'm going to call your mom to tell you what's going on, and we'll go from there. But that was pretty intense, and I spent a good 3 weeks in the hospital. I had a collapsed lung, and of course I was trending in this fashion where I wasn't taking care of myself anymore, and I wasn't being healthy, and I moved into the space of, this is what ultimately almost took your life. So I realized, first things first, it's time to get your habits back. Second thing is, you'll never let this happen to you from anybody, and you're a pretty small, frail person. You should probably start taking your cousin's advice and maybe start thinking about working out. And what the hell happened to your dreams of becoming a professional athlete? This isn't the way you're going to get it done. So it was a serious wake-up call, but it was the start of some of my traumas that I've obviously had to unpack. And unfortunately, at that stage of my life, that's when I really started developing sleeping issues that I still deal with today, quite frequently, and quite tragically, I would say, because it's debilitating when you don't sleep very well. And that's when it got really bad. So that was the catalyst in one of my near-death experiences that I had during those teenage years, and I've had a few of those, so that was like the first real serious one. So that was pretty traumatic, but of course it was a very important event in my life, because the doctors were like, yeah, you should take it easy for the next 3 or 4 months, and I was like, excuse my French, folks, but I was like, fuck that noise, I'm gonna start working out, because ain't nobody gonna do this to me again. And my cousin championed that conversation. He said, yeah, no, you're gonna see me in the gym in about 2-3 weeks. And that's when I started taking working out serious and getting back on the whole fitness and athletic train. Yeah.
That's fair. Would you say then, because of all of that, was that unfortunately the things that needed to happen because you were needing to find that side of your heritage?
Yeah, it was all a lie, right? Like, I thought that was part of our culture, part of our existence, was to be cool and gangster and hip. And who designed that, right? Like, who really created that narrative for us? And were these kids becoming subjected to that because they felt that pressure too? Probably, and just their circumstances. Mm-hmm. I'm able to realize that now, but back then I didn't. And it ultimately taught me that I didn't need to go that route, because I had nothing but opportunities with coaches, with mentors, with parents that cared. I had a roof over my head. I was just ultimately choosing to do this. And it made sense that, as intense and as traumatic as it was a serious wake-up call. And it completely reversed my life. It went back to, going back and serving others. And shortly thereafter, I got back into hanging out with the other crowds that I was with. And a lot of these kids were athletes. And they loved to play sports and just be really physically fit, and weren't into partying and doing all that bullshit. And it just so happened that they were part of the Cambodian community. And I started connecting with them. Then they started inviting me to this after school program, because my goal shifted from, okay, you screwed up, but you still want to play sports. Specifically, you still want to play football. So what does that journey look like? So I started hanging out with these kids, and these kids were like better athletes than I was. And I was cocky at the time. I was like, I'm the best athlete ever. These kids were better than me. So I was like, holy shit. I was full of it. I thought I was MVP, and these guys are running circles around me. What do I need to do to keep up?
Ego check.
Right? But more importantly, what it turned into was, what type of association and what type of community are we building here? In the context of, I guess, transparency and maybe their timelines. And it cultivated into a community league thing, where I got to learn a lot about the Cambodian communities and their struggles throughout their history, and why all these immigrants, the genocides, and why all their people had moved to a place like Edmonton to escape, and they were a close-knit community, and they were just trying to do the right things, and their parents were dealing with traumas, and their older siblings weren't dealing with it in the right way. They were getting involved with crime and gangs and this and that.
Traumas are a bitch.
Right?
And if you leave them unchecked, you're going to do worse shit.
Correct. And
so
that's
not just yourself, everyone else
100%.
around.
And that's what happened was we created this community program to keep the younger crowd out of trouble. And I got thrusted into a role as one of the older participants, as a person who was supervising and or watching over these younger kids, and we tried to keep them out of trouble. They need to learn a lot about, their culture and their history, not the ones that was, manipulated. They needed to learn about brotherhood and having roles and responsibilities and working hard. They wanted to follow their hobbies and their passions, which involved making music or arts or crafts or stuff like that. So we would spend most of the week either playing sports, learning about their Cambodian history, praying with the monks, or we started a band. And that happened for the next 2 or 3 years as I was preparing to try to get healthy enough again to pursue my football career. So I built really strong friendships and got my shit together and gave back to the communities at that junction when I could have just kept slipping. It was ultimately that catalyst or that traumatic event that allowed me to wise up and have some gratitude and have some graciousness, or have a perspective of not following in the traumas of others and letting that snowball, but focusing on your own journey and actually giving back. And having an opportunity to give back, and having an opportunity to follow in your coaches and your mentors that gave you a chance to try out for the soccer team and make it and believed in you.
I think
right?
That's super important to note, because I think a lot of the time we as a society like to look at things that are just happening to us all the time, and then we fall into that victimhood mentality that, oh, well, this is always going to happen to me, and then you kind of always learn to have that expectation that that's what you're going to look for. So then you're on high alert, and then you're just going to react the way that you always react. But if you have a moment to be thankful and actually look at it, and I know it's cliche because everyone's like, oh, this happened for a reason, but like I truly do think things do occur for you to either have that lesson learned and do something different, or you're just going to continue to repeat that lesson.
Correct. Yeah, they're loops, right? And you ultimately choose which lens you're going to choose from, and you ultimately get to choose what is this teaching you and what can I do better next time. Unfortunately, society, or the heck you want to call it, a lot of us just get in the read and reaction loop, and it's easier to deflect or blame others, and then ultimately claim an existence or claim a character of, this is who you are, accept me for what it is. Hell no.
I used to run around being like, I'm just an asshole and you just have to deal with it. And now I'm like, no, actually, I was just masking.
Right. It's complete. It's a complete deflection, and it's a complete dismissal of having responsibility for every event that you're a part of. Whether you like it or not, you're not always going to have positive perspectives or positive outcomes.
And not everyone's going to like you.
Exactly.
You just have to deal with it instead of trying to people please and get everybody to like you.
100%. And that was something that I needed to learn, and I'm still learning, because that's just ultimately in my nature. I use that as a catalyst to start my journey in the fitness and health and wellness department on a consistent basis, because I loved the grind, I loved practicing, I loved all of those components. I just had to try out something, and I got the taste of what I didn't want at that point. But during that journey, and as I started moving into that space, a lot of the things I thought I was doing that were healthy were causing me issues, namely my diet and nutrition, and that was just my mom's best effort to help me in that sense. But she didn't even know that what she was feeding us wasn't that healthy. She started looking into it a little bit deeper on her own context and being like, wait, if I introduce this so-called quote-unquote alternative medicine, it helps reduce inflammation or mucus in the body. And that was things like oil of oregano and garlic and lemon. But she was still taking tons of the pharmaceuticals and then still ingesting, frozen foods. And I was doing the same too. And during that tenure, I wanted to get bigger because I was a really small kid. And I put on like 40, 50 pounds of muscle in less than a year. But it was all through supplements and all these filler foods. So I was sick all the time, like all the time. And this was on top of still dealing with my traumas and not sleeping right and pushing my body to extremes. So not only did I start getting bigger and I looked a certain way, but I had less endurance and I was getting injured a lot. because of the way I was going about my workouts, it was bodybuilding and isolative exercises, and I translated that energy or that intensity into the bodybuilding world instead of balancing out my training.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I was like, were you doing any sort of mobility? Were you
Absolutely
doing
not.
Stretching?
Stretching, yes.
Because, I mean, the goal of bodybuilding is to just get tight as fuck
Right.
and big.
Right.
But it's like at no point are you actually doing any sort of other types of training in terms of different reps, different sets. Like, I mean, yes, there's like pyramid and whatever else that you can do, but it's like you're not actually training power. You're not necessarily training endurance. You're not working on those different modalities that are part of an entirely healthy body.
Yeah, and it was...
You're just making yourself tight.
Yeah, and that's all I knew because I was going after what my cousin said. He said, just work harder. And he made the same mistakes, and we can chop it up now and be like both of us now. We're like, what the hell were we doing, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's good. It has a time and place for putting on size and mass, but
you got to do it properly.
There are other ways,
Right, and I essentially sabotaged my athleticism. Still going after these, these components. The only thing that was saving me was, of course, the community league and participating in sports, 2 or 3 times a week. But I was putting in probably 4 to 5 hours a day of physical fitness, and then maybe sleeping 3 hours if I was lucky, and then ingesting all these processed foods or supplements to try to keep me going. And yeah, it was gonna be a ticking time bomb eventually, and that's what I essentially started feeling.
Your system was probably fucked.
Oh yeah, this weird pulls and strains and whatnot. And like I said, folks, previously, my mother's health started to slowly deteriorate, and it just got worse and worse as I moved into my adulthood, and moved into my late teens, early 20s, and it all came to a head shortly after that same fellow who stabbed me actually got out shortly after he did, because we were all youths at the time, and he got out on, I guess, good behavior. And long story short, he was still looking for me. And at this point, I'd finished high school. I tried out for the all-star team, didn't make it. I was doing the community league thing. Now I'm like 19, 20. I'm upgrading at Center High. And right before my mom got really sick and ended up in a coma and almost died, this fool showed up out of nowhere again, a couple of years later, and tried to start shit with me again, escalating into him pulling a knife out again. But this time I was ready for it, and I saw it. And he had a backup, but his backup took off on him, and so did mine, unfortunately. So now it's 1-on-1, and he started this nonsense again, and I was ready for it. But I obviously snapped, and thank God for the community league perspective and being the bigger person or understanding the bigger dynamic. I snapped, was trying to look for a weapon to take him out as he left the scene and was talking shit. And, the leader of the community league and all my good friends were like, okay, calm down. Right? Like, I know it's rough and he's doing all this shit, but like, is there a better way of dealing with this? Because guess what? It's Friday, because this happened on a Friday, and you're responsible for taking care of like the 4 and 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds today. Can you bring this energy to the gym? And it was like an instant, like, get your shit together, Taurean. Right? Like, I know you're dealing with that on that context, but you can't control other people's perspectives. You can't control other people's lenses and how they're going to action things out for you. So are you going to sit here and stay angry and upset, or are you going to move forward with your life? Are you going to move forward with the opportunities that are presented for you? Are you going to have an ability to hold space when it matters for something like that? But right now, faced with this event where you could ultimately change somebody's life for the better, are you going to choose that over this reaction and this is me bullshit?
It's true. It's difficult because when you're in the actual moment and you're in the shit, it's hard because you're in that reactivity, and your brain and your amygdala, your flight or fight response is literally just trying to get you through it, and you feel like you need to do what you need to do in order to do it.
Right.
So it's always fantastic to have a different perspective of someone who's not in it, just being like, hey, how about we just calm down a little bit?
Yeah.
But even then you're like, fuck off, don't tell me to calm down.
Right. Right. And I mean, I think there needs to be an opportunity to essentially hit the switch, right? Like, at the same context with me sharing this, he was trying to be physically assaultive for it, and if he would have actually touched me, I would have handled it, right? Like, I think you do have to have the capacity to go there if necessary. And what happened to me provided that substance and literally provided a real life experience, because you don't want the other end of the spectrum where someone's threatening yourself or your family and you have no wherewithal or ability to defend. Because again, I said this about 5 minutes ago, you can't control other people's perspectives and the projections in their actions. What you can ultimately control is the protection and the safety of you people, yourself, and the people you care about. I encourage everybody to get some form of physical fitness. If there's one thing that you would really want to focus on, it's self-defense. It's combat training. Because ultimately when you get into combat training, the extremisms of it, you have the training in which to de-escalate the situation. And I've had, events happen in my life where I've been able to do that, so it doesn't need to get the blows because of the training element that I chose. Now, was that a hard experience? Absolutely.
Yeah, because you just want to fucking unleash sometimes,
right.
But it's also your due diligence because you have the training
right.
to only use as much force as needed.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, those experiences ultimately shaped my choices to move into, my career path, because they were there to remind me of the value and the benefits of team sport and fitness and all the luxuries and gifts that it provided me, understanding different personality types, being disciplined towards a goal and working towards it regardless of your emotions and your day-to-day struggles, coming together for a common goal, getting feedback on all ends of spectrums, having somebody dedicated and passionate towards coaching you and helping you grow as a person or as a performance athlete. And I was able to, again, translate that into the community league space. And I actually coached a couple of those younger kids to victories in their respective sports, in volleyball once and then in soccer, because I was asked by the community league leader to do this. So, at that point now I'm facing an opportunity to go out to play football for the goals and the passions and the dreams that I wanted. But again, I wasn't addressing some of my limitations on my training side of things. And I was still very much in my head. I still deal with that to this day, where I doubt myself a lot. I judge myself a lot. I've been a very judgmental person on my own end of things, especially for myself. And during that tenure of trying to, make it in the sport, I overtrained again, wasn't getting enough rest. I judged myself far too much, and I wasn't training right. So when I finally went out to go try my hand at this professional sport of football, I started getting some pretty substantial injuries. And it essentially sabotaged my opportunities, because I was definitely good enough to make it to the pro ranks. But of course I was fatigued, I was exhausted. Mentally, physically, and it came out when I actually tried to go to practices and perform, and I started getting some pretty crazy injuries. Some of the worst ones were I herniated a disc in my lower back. I tore a pubic symphysis in my groin area, which for most people, if you tear that small little almost O-ring ligament, you may never run again, let alone do anything explosive and stuff like that. So I was dealing with that my first year out, in Victoria, trying to play football out there. But again, these things sound like traumas and tragedies, and undoubtedly they are, and they can creep in with emotions, but they can be there to serve you. And what it really did is it put me in front of people that understood the human body and the prerequisites that go behind, I'm going to use fancy terms in my career path, like anatomy trains and gait patterns. For more people to understand, a universal truth is just moving with efficiency and preventing injuries. And I met quite a few awesome physiotherapists that didn't hold anything back, and doctors that didn't hold anything back, and were just completely bluntly honest with me and said, well, you have a weak core, right? Your mobility's shit. you've been training too stiff for too long and you can't rotate anymore, and you need to start learning how to gain these functions back. That's why these things ruptured and pulled and ripped, and it's fatiguing you on top of your mindset behind this, and you're not letting things go. Well, of course, it's snowballing. Everything's working against you from your choices. And they just straight up called me out on it.
I think that's what everybody needs, though, to be honest, because it's like we like to start people with core bracing and learning how to actually move their body in proper ways, because so many people even get rotation from their low back, and you're like, that's not where it comes from, right? So having those injuries ourselves makes us better able to help other people, but it's putting aside that fucking ego to actually do the work that doesn't seem that hard.
Well, one thing that we can probably agree upon, I came around a quote and then I saw it again, go figure, the universe serves you, is what do you think learning is? Learning's failing. Learning's a negative connotation or a negative circumstance coming out of an event.
Yeah, because you're taught you always need to, to prosper, be successful.
Right.
Can't fail, but it's like the failures is what actually gets you to learn something and be better.
And at those pivotal points, you ultimately could choose to learn that, or you can deflect and, like she said, follow your ego space and ignore it, or try to overcome it with more ego, more bravado, and fight it. Exactly, and you're going to fight it, and then the unfortunate thing is the universe or the world will ultimately go with your choices. You make your own lens. So you can ultimately choose to discover and investigate more and meet more people that will call you out on your shit. You can have a slice of humble pie. Or you can go hang out with like-minded people and continue to, beat the head of that proverbial drum and find people that will enable this behavior, and you won't learn, and you ultimately get to choose which path. And that's what this really started teaching me was I would run into people who were willing to try to push through and punch through, and I understood their dynamic and their egos and how they carried themselves. It was very vulnerable and it was very volatile, but they would mask it with this overgrown sense of bravado, and whenever asked a real question they would dismiss it or get condescending and rude. Or you'd meet people who are just asking you questions, get you to formulate your own opinion and then apply there, and then they would check in with you and get feedback from you, because ultimately they cared and they were moving on the path that mattered most for them, that gave them growth or gave them perspective and helped them learn, and they were becoming experts in that field. And then if they continued this consistency with their projections, their action, their communication, people would seek them out. So I ultimately chose that latter description that I just shared. And it was interesting to see how many people live on the cusp of that path and ultimately choose which way they want to go with. And as I started moving into the opportunities and the choices to eventually become a personal trainer, it was pretty apparent this was a universal truth when it came to not only fitness, but life choices. And I saw that firsthand because I played the role of the observer, and I played the role of humility and being an apprentice and getting mentorship. And I could see it play out time and time again. And it's afforded me my, I guess, as some people quote it, expertise in my field. It allowed me to pursue more in education on how to help people navigate through these things. And what I came around to seeing was it was some of our actions and our lifestyles ultimately create things for us. And if we're going to apply it to a vehicle for fitness, we're in the common same positions, we're in the common same postures, we do the common same patterns. Are you breaking those molds, or are you exploring at the right time and doing it at the right, sequence, or they're using the right systems to break some of those limitations and allow you to open that box and allow you to move in a different fashion or with efficiency? Or are you still feeding into the same system? Are you addressing it and investigating it in a whole holistic approach and using certain modalities or using certain habits that you can choose to break down restrictions and tightness and inflammation, getting into mobility drills that help foster some ranges of motion and mobility you once had prior to the restrictions, or even more intensively when you've had injuries? Are you applying all the benefits from different modalities that we can see from expressions of physical activity, which can be dance, yoga, calisthenics, martial arts, bodybuilding, Olympic lifts. Is there some form of application at the right time that's serving your body, unique to your capabilities, and also, more importantly, addressing some of the limitations and going after the stuff that you may not necessarily want to? That kind of designed my business model, and without all the experiences that I've had in my timelines, I may have never gotten there, right? I may have never had such expertise or such, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Efficiency with designing these systems because of mentors. It was never me, it was the mentors, it was the experiences that I've had, or the learning and the failures, and it was questioning my own egos and my own issues, and then questioning it with the right lens, in my opinion, with investigation, not fighting the growth that was behind that, and really just being humble and finding the sources of literature and the mentors and the coaches that taught me these important prerequisites towards movement, the mindset behind movement, why it's important in habits, and so forth.
So I feel like this is going to be a perfect segue to go to part 2.
Yes.
There's going to be a part 2. I feel like where we talk a little bit more about, these are obviously some ground rules that you've left for people to think about, but when we go to part 2 and you actually speak a little bit more about what happened to your football career, I feel like that'll give people a little bit more understanding of how you got to be where you are today.
This is very true, and yes, I think we'll need a second part because it's hard to get it all in one.
Yes.
Thanks for tuning in.
We will see you back for part 2.
Rather soon. Get outside, folks. It's a beautiful day. We're filming this in the middle of summer. I'm heading out now.
Perfect.
Till then.
Peace.